Hey, wanna hear a joke? What's an Englishman's favorite sport? Racism! Oh yeah, it's gonna be one of those episodes. Get comfy! Back in 2014, Jennifer Kent came out with a tiny indie horror film called The Babadook, and it instantly made a huge splash in the horror community and started a yearly trend of indie horror smashes that all became mainstream hits. Admittedly, if you ask me, I wasn't exactly sold on it when I watched it. I mean, it's fine, but it's certainly the least experimental of that series of indie horror films, and it suffers a lot from her inexperience. But for a debut, it showed massive promise and a great cinematic eye. It was a film where, even if I found it flawed, I still knew Kent was a force to be reckoned with. So I was absolutely ecstatic when I got the chance to see her follow up at IFFBoston this April. Yeah, this video is pretty late. I'm sorry. Blame my depression.
I got depression.
But this is a different beast entirely from The Babadook. Not only is this not a horror film, but it's a film that needs a lot of important historical context in order to properly discuss. Yeah, that joke at the beginning was very representative of how the rest of this is gonna go. You're gonna get uncomfy. Get used to it. Back in the old days, pretty much every European country was doing some kind of colonialism or imperialism, and usually oppressing some group along the way. But England was probably the fucking king. And England had their favorite targets for oppression too. The two favorites that they had for sure were a native population of a land they'd stolen. Trust me, that applies to a lot of people. And the Irish. The English hated the Irish. They still kind of do, but it's much more of a tolerating of the Irish now rather than, indentured servitude. And then England stole an entire island country from its people and decided they'd send the Irish there as prisoners. So they had a land full of people who were both of a darker skin color and displaced completely by the English, and they also had in that land a bunch of Irish. It was like paradise to them. In other words, the Aboriginal people of Australia and the Irish people sent their experience what we in the business like to call human rights abuses. And Nightingale is the story of that. Revenge stories have existed since Edison invented the camera, but few have felt so emotionally powerful. Just describing this as a politically charged revenge film is kind of selling short how much it can hit. There's certain things that come to mind when you think of those things, but none of them would grasp the oomph that this film brings to the subject. Set off by one of the most brutal scenes I've seen in cinematic history, this is an unflinching tale of horrors of power over the powerless and revolt. It's one that refuses to censor that pain and suffering. It pulls no emotional punches. This is a film that has scenes that left me shaking and speechless. The two leads go through hell, and you feel like you have too. The film needs less of a content warning than it needs a fucking Surgeon's General warning for causing anxiety attacks. It does not pull its punches. In a lot of ways, that's because the film is uncompromising in its portrayal of the events. This film doesn't just hint at the racism shown towards the Aboriginal people. It recounts vivid stories of oppression. You see them whipped and sold into slavery. There are multiple vivid rape scenes, and none of it feels exploitative. It all just feels honest. And really, excluding them might have made this a much less honest tale. But you see, this film hits its emotional chord in a very peculiar way, by reinforcing them through the characters. When we talk about characters in a film, we often discuss their arcs as personal and meaningful to them. But it's rarely like that in real life. Every event here reverberates through all of the characters. The Nightingale may be mostly about the titular Nightingale, but everything that happens to her and because of her is not only felt through her perspective, but seeing the reactions of those around her and how they respond to her. The film has no interest in being about how just one person experiences the world. The characters talk about it, change their future actions to reflect this new knowledge. It all contributes to this living, breathing world. A world that hurts all the more vividly when we can see the effects of oppression reflected in everyone. And as such, the audience understands the scope of it so much more. But that kind of effective emotional storytelling is impossible without the right performers to do it. Luckily for us, Kent delivers a million times over here. Yet again, Kent is able to coax out a vulnerable, raw, and simply gorgeous performance out of her female lead. This time, Aisling Franciosi of Game of Thrones fame. This was a character that required a performer to go to the most unflattering of depths to portray pain and suffering beyond comprehension of most people, and it's one that can make an average actor balk at the challenge of it. And yet, Aisling's performance as Claire not only clears that bar, but eviscerates it entirely, providing us with a fully unique and vivid look at our character's psyche in her every second on screen. Even more impressive though is the performance of Babadook, a first-time Aboriginal actor that brought a performance that most veterans would dream of. There's heart here, he has a harsh resilience in his actions, an angry exterior that has been produced from years of abuse, and a refusal to let go of his people's traditions. It's not a front, but rather who he's been forced to morph into to survive. And throughout their journey together, we get to see him more than the angry soul he begins off as. It's something worth witnessing for yourself. It's all without getting into Jennifer Kent's control over the visuals. With the Babadook, we were able to see a larger-than-life style. It was vivid, intense, and by far one of the most striking elements of that film. People looking for that style here, though, may be disappointed. This film is much, much more understated. Not functional, mind you, it still contains quite a bit of flair, but only when it needs it. Usually the camera is complementing the characters and their actions rather than simply making them, and it saves its flair from the more reflective moments. And certainly not the most striking film I've seen all year, but it didn't need to be. It's not going to sacrifice its substance for style, and I really appreciate that choice from Kent, particularly with the film's more somber context. Speaking of which, the Nightingale's portrayal of oppression hasn't been universally praised. There's been a lot of controversy surrounding Jennifer Kent's decision to have the Aboriginal character be the secondary lead, having his story take a backseat to a white woman's experience of suffering. Some have even compared it to Green Book, saying it's using the suffering of people of color and a road trip to show how racism can be solved if we just get along.
It would break down racial barriers and maybe be a crossover hit.
It ain't easy being white, it ain't easy being brown.
Now, as a white person myself, I can't really actually comment if this is completely correct. I don't really have the right to say that. But I do think I'm at least qualified as a film analyst to say why I think this comes off a lot more genuine to me than Green Book ever did. When watching this film, I never quite felt like it was trying to imply that what our lead was going through is in any way the exact same as what Aboriginal people in the film go through. Sure, what our lead goes through is horrifying and traumatic, but it never feels as defeating as any of the brutality shown towards the people of color here. It's more about how common the oppressors are. It teaches them how they've been trained to hate each other by an oppressor that just kinda hated both of them already. Both have had their culture stripped from them. The Irish can no longer speak Gaelic or sing Irish folk songs, while the Aboriginal people are forced to erase all signs of their culture under threat of being hunted down and murdered and enslaved. Both have been separated from their families through their forced relocations, and both have been taught that the English are superior. It's just the Irish have been taught that they're at least above the Aboriginal people. And that's why they get less harsh punishments, because they look more like the English. That privilege the Irish got may have pitted them against each other, but in reality they were held down by the same oppressor. It's a lesson Australia is still struggling to learn. Even after English rule has been shaken from Australia, the sons and daughters of those who have had their families oppressed still believe the English were right about the Aboriginal people, and still continue the English's genocidal tactic until this very day, where they still have barely given an apology or reparations. And that's what the story is trying to comment on by having the lead be an Irish woman. It's demonstrating how little they've opened their eyes to the truth and that they were held back by the same force, tricked and lied to. The Nightingale really shows that only those who have suffered the most they can bear and live can listen to others who have done the same. That said, I wouldn't say this film is perfect even without those critiques. This film kind of meanders towards the end. There's several places where it feels like it's about to end or wind down, but just kind of continues on. That kind of loss of energy is not an ideal way to end your film. It really just seems like it goes out with a whimper rather than a grand hurrah. Made what were some incredible ending scenes feel out of breath and straggling, like a marathon runner who's just trying to finish, but just so desperately wants to lay down and die. There's also a nightmare sequence that borders on cliche with its imagery and could have been cut out entirely. Kent similarly had this sort of mixed ability with the Babadook, but with how much she'd improved here, it's a bit disappointing to see it still kind of present, particularly when her camera work in both was splendid, even with the more mixed elements involved. But really, when a film hits you like this, what can you do but applaud? Particularly when it does so while delivering a potent message too. When I said the Babadook showed promise of a budding auteur, this is what I meant. She's evolved so well and created what is easily one of my favorite films of 2019 so far, and with such a jump after only her second effort, I can't wait to see what's next. This film didn't get much of a theatrical run. It had a tiny budget and a small distributor, but it definitely deserves your support. It's a film needed for a time when people still refuse to acknowledge the pain we've helped perpetuate by only focusing on our own struggle, never truly listening and trying to understand those who've been hurt even worse. Jennifer Kent's The Nightingale gets a 9 out of 10.
Shugo sakura ga shugo kyuin shugo darasa